Okay, then. Boundaries, right? They matter in life and in love. And I'm sure you've heard it before. Maybe someone has accused you of breaching their boundaries, or maybe you know what it feels like when somebody crosses yours. But just how good are you at setting and maintaining boundaries? Dr. Rachel Hannam is the director of North Brisbane Psychologists. Rachel, thanks for joining us. Can we just begin with a sort of a basic definition of exactly what you're talking about when you say relationship boundaries? What does that mean?
Yeah, good question. So I go with the simplest definition I know from Dr. Brene Brown, which is knowing what is okay with me and what is not okay with me. And yeah, once I'm clear on that, I have a boundary. That could be to do with, could be something as simple as physical distance. It could be amount of energy and time I want to give something or someone. It could be around my level of involvement in something, or it could be a boundary around confidentiality.
Okay, so it's not really something that you're kind of taught how to do beyond the obvious ones in regards to my body integrity, things around consent and so on. So let's stay with the kind of the grayer area of maybe emotional boundaries. What are some of the common problems that you might encounter from couples who are seeking help because their boundaries either aren't being set properly or people are breaching them regularly?
Yeah, well, I think boundaries are very connected to knowing what your needs are and knowing what your values are. So with couples, we often see that one person is maybe taking more responsibility than they need to for, the emotional work in the relationship, the communication, or perhaps for the practical tasks. Some realm or other in their life, one partner's taking too much responsibility and the other one's not taking enough. Sometimes we call this over-functioning and under-functioning, and we end up having our boundaries crossed or crossing our partner's boundary when we haven't figured out what our needs around support, communication, empathy, understanding, responsibility. If we haven't figured that out and communicated that, then we get a bit lopsided. And we see that a lot with couples.
For instance, if I maybe don't need a problem that I present to my husband to be quote unquote fixed, but I do really need a cuddle from him to sort of reassure me that I'm okay, we're okay, it's okay. If I'm not getting that because I haven't asked for that, is that what we're talking about?
That's a really good example. So knowing what you want before you go into a communication, like in your example, if all you're looking for is for him to listen and give you some understanding and reassurance, then saying that obviously makes it much clearer for him that you're not looking for a solution at that point. Yes.
And what are some other examples of common boundary-related problems that couples face?
Yeah, well, there are many. One might be that a couple has difficulty agreeing on how much energy, time, or involvement to have in their children's lives or in the lives of other people around them, family members. It might be around how much time somebody spends at work or works from home. So these issues around time, energy, level of involvement, this is quite common in today's busy world, and learning to find where the boundaries are for yourself and within the relationship is hugely important in a long-term relationship so that needs are met. Like I said, needs for time together, connection, intimacy, communication. These needs can't be met if there's not clarity around what each partner needs, and if there's not this shared understanding.
Dr. Rachel Hannam is with you. She's the director of North Brisbane Psychologists. You're on ABC Radio Brisbane and Queensland talking about relationship boundaries, how to set them. We might get to a couple of your tips for how to set or how to maintain boundaries effectively within relationships. But Rachel, I have read that there may kind of be two types of people with poor boundary setting habits, if you like. They come in two flavours. That there are those who take too much responsibility for the emotions of others, and those who expect others to take too much responsibility for their own emotions and actions. For instance, you can't go out with your friends without me because you know how jealous I get. You have to stay home with me. Like that obviously isn't a healthy statement. So how could you change a situation like that?
That's a good example. Yeah, because it's clearly, when you say it's not healthy, to me it's not workable. That's not going to work in the long term for the relationship. If that situation you described is coming from jealousy, which it may well be, that can relate to having, low self-esteem or low self-worth, which can lead to insecurity and fear and jealousy. So sometimes there's quite deep work for people to do in order to, find within themselves a sense of self-worth, knowing that their needs matter, but knowing that other people's needs matter as well. And a lot of our work in therapy is kind of looking at people's relationships with needs, with their own needs and other people's, because they may not have seen a healthy example of that growing up. So what you're talking about, I see in terms of needs. Either my needs matter more than others, or other people's needs matter more than mine. And when we've got that out of balance, we're going to either cross someone else's boundaries by being too demanding, like in your example, or we're going to let others cross our boundaries by being too self-sacrificing and approval-seeking, and saying yes when we really should be saying no. I hope that answers your question. I'm not sure.
It does. And I guess moving into a different kind of relationship, if you're in sort of a caring relationship for somebody, it sometimes can be hard to know when to set a limit on how much to care. Does that sort of make sense? And is that something that you address in counselling as well?
Absolutely. And in that sort of scenario, I think the clues are in our emotions and in our body. So when we begin to feel resentment or exhaustion or unhealthy guilt and shame, these emotions are very often a signal or a clue that we are going beyond our limits, that we are being, self-sacrificing and saying yes to things when really we need to find a way to have a conversation, to pull back, to honour our limits and look after ourselves as well. And that can be really hard. But definitely resentment and exhaustion are good indicators that we haven't respected our own limits.
If you're in a relationship and it's been ongoing for some time, it's a long-term relationship, and maybe, as you said, you never had effective or sound boundaries modelled to you, so you've never known to kind of insist on them or set them or maintain them yourself, and patterns of behaviour therefore have become fairly entrenched. Can you turn things around if you felt resentment maybe starting to creep in? Is it all over, Red Rover? Or Rachel, can you actually do something even after years of a certain pattern of boundary breaking?
Definitely, Kat. Yeah, absolutely. I've worked with many people who've needed to do that, and one of the mantras that sometimes helps them is, I'm choosing discomfort over resentment, because it is uncomfortable to start having these conversations with your loved ones, such as, for years I've done this and now I need to say enough and I need to pull back, and I'm sorry that I wasn't aware of how I was feeling until just now. And, so we do need to take responsibility for the fact that we have unwittingly crossed our own boundaries for so long, pushed ourselves beyond our limits, and now we're changing the game. There's no point in blaming the other person for feeling exhausted or resentful. But it is just an uncomfortable and difficult conversation to have with the other person, to say, look, things need to change. I need to pull back. Enough is enough for me. And I'm sorry that it's taken me this long to figure it out.
ABC Radio Brisbane and Queensland. If you've got some thoughts or comments to make on this conversation about boundary setting within relationships, the phone number is 1300 222 612. That's 1300 222 612. I suppose I'm a bit of a proponent of agathism, Rachel. I try to be eternally optimistic, and I do like to think that all relationships could be fixed if problems are identified and properly dealt with, but maybe that isn't always the case. What are some indicators that you might not be able to save things?
Yeah, well, some relationships have a lot of damage has been done over many, many years, and we do occasionally see that, and people feel like the amount of work and effort and energy and time that will be required to repair the relationship is not something they're willing to do. And in those cases, I respect people's decisions. If they're not willing, they're not willing. We can't force people to put in that effort and energy. But I'm like you, I'm also very hopeful that if people learn the skills that they need and get the support that would enable them to put in that time and energy, most relationships have a good fighting chance of surviving with the right skills and with enough effort and energy, for sure.
Okay, so let's run with a common scenario and maybe some language around boundaries that could help address it. People who are maybe sucked into pointless fights or debates, like arguments that seem to go nowhere. How could you stop that from happening? What kind of language could you use to offset that kind of problematic behaviour?
Are you talking about perhaps useless debates that people get in with each other on the internet, for example?
Well, I mean, possibly, but I'm sort of thinking as well about in relationships. If you've identified problematic behaviour and you've said, look, this isn't working for me, you're crossing my boundary, and then it spirals into a bit of an argument about that because maybe there's a lack of effective communication, how can you begin to have those awkward conversations with people to bring about positive change?
Yeah, well, we covered in another interview, you and I, some of the skills that people need to use. They need to avoid getting into criticism and blame and defensiveness, and instead finding ways to just say what they're feeling and what they're needing for their partner. That doesn't guarantee anything will change. The research shows about 6 out of 10 problems in relationships, in long-term relationships, will be perpetual, that they won't be resolved. And so we need to learn to live with differences and unresolvable problems, but we do need to get better at communicating about those problems when they are affecting us. And one of the ways we can do that is say, I feel upset, I feel disappointed, I feel lonely, I feel hurt, I feel frustrated, and what I would maybe what would help me right now is, and it doesn't mean we can solve the problem, but we may be able to be creative in thinking of ways we could get our needs met, or at least be heard and understood. There's a lot of work, there's a lot I could say, because there's a lot of work to be done in learning this effective communication skill set, but definitely we need to stay out of blame and criticism and contempt, because those forms of communication always trigger defensiveness in the other person.
Yeah.
And it just doesn't work.
It just doesn't work, you're right. Well, thank you for giving us lots to think about and some helpful ways forward, Rachel. Looking forward to speaking with you again.
No problem.
Dr. Rachel Hannam on ABC Radio Brisbane and Queensland, Director of North Brisbane Psychologist.